Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar on revolving energy funds. I'm James Bramwell from Sustainability Victoria. So Sustainability Victoria is an agency of the Victorian State Government charged with supporting Victorians to use resources more sustainably and to take practical action on climate change. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are hosting this webinar. I personally am on the lands of the Tanarung people, and I'd like to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. We're really pleased to support this webinar today, which will be delivered by Alexi and Paul from Ironbark Sustainability. And I might hand straight over to Alexi.
Okay, thank you very much, James. My fellow panelists, can you please mute yourself and turn your webinar videos off so we can make sure we have no bandwidth issues? I'm going to ask another question to all our friends out there. Can you see a screen that says Revolving Energy Funds for Local Government? I believe the yeses are going to come in very quickly. Thank you. All right, apologies for those technical difficulties. GoToWebinar are going to get a really nasty letter. I'm not going to really do an intro anymore. I'm not going to do housekeeping because most of you know how this works. You can ask questions through the GoToWebinar question box. This is being recorded, so anything that you missed, don't worry. We're going to keep it informal. We're going to keep it even more casual than we once were going to because we are already 5 or 10 minutes beforehand and we're not going to get a big intro. Suffice to say, jump into the GoToWebinar question box at any time. You can't be heard, but you can ask questions through there and we will tally up all of the questions or any of the comments or disagreements that you might have about this. I'm going to acknowledge the traditional owners as well. I appreciate that we're on traditional lands throughout the Kulin Nation and Wurundjeri people in Melbourne and other areas, and also pay my respects like you did. James, I'm not going to give an introduction on Ironbark. I'm barely going to give you an introduction on who's here. Suffice to say, we had 60 odd registrations from 40 organisations, a lot of councils, SV, DELP. Congratulations to Bendigo and Shepparton. I believe you guys had 4 people from each, so well done, Keith and Sharon. And finally, we asked in advance, what do you know? Have you ever been involved in implementing or managing a revolving energy fund? And I've just quickly got rid of a poll to save a bit of time. I was going to ask what you thought. The general understanding would be, but I'm just going to get straight into it and show you that the majority of people who are attending here, the absolute vast majority, have had no experience, which I must say surprised me a little bit, but it probably makes it even more important to have this webinar. And finally, as I pass over to you, Paul, we have a lot of questions. Don't worry about getting these notes down. We'll send you the slides, but these are the questions that you had in advance, and we have tailored the webinar around these. Any questions that we don't get to today, don't worry, we'll get onto them. I'm going to pass on to Paul. I apologise for that quick intro, but looking down here, most of you guys know us. Paul, over to you. I'm not going to even give you much of an intro, mate, because you know people and have got a lot of experience, and we can talk about that another time. You are now presenter. Over to you, Paul.
Great, thank you, Lex. I'm just going to set up my screen. All right, so we're going to talk about revolving energy funds, of course, what they are, how they work. We also have guest presenters from Mount Alexander Shire Council and Whitehorse City Council to talk about how their revolving funds work, talk about some issues, strategies on how to set them up, and do a Q&A. We will spend a bit of time talking about the recent federal government stimulus funding, which has just come out, because it's very timely and it actually fits very well into this presentation, because all revolving energy funds need seed funding. All right, what does a revolving energy fund do? It starts with capital funding to deliver projects like LED bulk street lighting upgrades, like large-scale solar rooftop projects. It can also include startup funding for things that aren't about energy. So, for example, one of the best projects I delivered when I was running sustainability revolving funds at a couple of councils was to upgrade the fax system within a council so that it automatically emailed any faxes that came through to our staff members. So that saved, I think it was something like 60 to 100 reams of paper a year. So it can include paper reduction, it can include water savings, putting in shower heads, energy efficient toilets, or anything else that saves money and resources long term. In terms of how it actually works, a fund, typically the first step is to identify sustainability projects, allocate capital to those projects, obviously deliver the projects, then save money, and then reinvest in the fund. All of these projects typically require startup funding, and we'll talk a little bit about the sorts of startup projects which are useful for that. And also, this system that you see now can easily be overcomplicated. And so we'll talk about making sure it's simple and easy to implement and not spending time on the things that matter, not the things that don't matter. So who's got one? Which councils have got a revolving fund, either energy or resource efficiency? We've included a bunch of logos on the screen there. There are a lot of organisations outside of Australia who also use revolving funds. As mentioned, we will have Whitehorse and Mount Alexander presenting on their funds. I personally, when I used to work for councils, ran the revolving funds for both Banyule and Nillumbik councils.
Hey, Paul, can I just jump in there really quickly? Are you able to just minimise your GoToWebinar box? It seems to be, if people saying that that's distracting, it's on the top. We'll move it out of the way. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Don't leave.
No, we're still here.
I'll put it down there so you can't see it.
Great.
All right, so what is good about revolving energy funds? In theory, it provides long-term funding and savings to resource-saving projects. We'll talk a little bit later on about why this is in theory. It is and can be a bridge to finance teams. I found a picture online that looks like your average finance team. Hope that doesn't offend anyone. And in fact, this is usually the most important outcome from a revolving fund, a bridge between sustainability, resource projects, and making sure the finance team is across it, supportive and understanding of what is being delivered. And importantly, once set up, a fund like this means that council staff don't need to keep going back to councillors and senior management and asking for very small amounts of money for small and simple projects. It's essentially a structure that is set up and then it enables the staff to go ahead and deliver projects that make sense. What do revolving funds not solve? Well, it doesn't solve the issue that it is a line item in your budget that can be cut. So it's not this new thing which no one else can touch or can see or understand. It is simply a line item in your budget and it needs to justify itself year in, year out as a good spend of ratepayers' money. It generally is not particularly useful for very large projects, with the exception of the seed funding, where that is usually targeted at larger projects. It's usually better for small, simple, ongoing improvements to facilities, buildings, and operations. And it is typically underutilised for things that are not energy, even though they can be some of the best projects that you can deliver. And it is typically underutilised for community outreach and community projects. Speaking of community, the majority of this presentation will be talking about internal revolving funds for council operations. However, I thought it would be useful just to touch base on examples of external community-facing revolving funds that councils have set up and have run with. There are actually lots of examples of this. I'm only going to pick out two. One is the Sustainable Melbourne Fund. That now no longer operates like it used to, but in effect that was a fund set up by Melbourne City Council to invest in projects both within its council, within other councils, and within the community to reduce resource use and to draw money back into the fund. So it was a standard and fairly straightforward revolving energy fund. There is now the Sustainable Australia Fund, which doesn't necessarily do the same thing, and it is actually now commercial operation, but it was originally set up as a revolving fund and now has been outsourced beyond council. We are aware of a group of councils in New South Wales who in effect are using a PPA project and the management fees that they have included within the PPA to fund and drive and deliver community energy efficiency and also council programs to reduce energy and greenhouse emissions. So they're essentially using funding that councils are delivering to resource and invest in community efficiency projects. The key with any of these community revolving funds is it is all about whether it creates income that the councils can then control and reallocate. So it's, in terms of community revolving funds, it's very much about, is it a logical, sustainable business model, which we can then reinvest in projects that we direct. All right, so that's all I'm going to talk about when it comes to community revolving funds, but I think it's an important part of the discussion, noting there will be Q&A later. What if my council it just won't work for whatever reason? The key thing to keep in mind is that revolving funds are not a panacea. They are not the superhero that will solve all of your problems into infinity around getting funds to deliver sustainability projects. The strategies and approaches that we'll talk about today are relevant, whether you're running a revolving fund or whether you're delivering a resource efficiency program. So we've tailored it to be relevant no matter whether you can integrate this into your council operations or whether you're just delivering resource efficiency projects. So the key thing to keep in mind, whether it's this program or other programs, is you really need to be looking at a mix of funding sources, both council project bids, which you put up all the time, external funding, like the local roads and community infrastructure program, and then a revolving fund can be part of that funding mix. It is never the only thing which funds sustainability projects. All right, I'm now going to hand over, or rather we'll enable Ian to talk through Whitehorse City Council and how their energy management fund operates.
Ian, you should be able to talk. Go for it. Welcome, Ian. Thank you. Can you unmute yourself? Thank you.
Yes, there you go. Hello, everybody. Yes, Whitehorse is 2 years into its journey of a revolving fund, but I've entitled this, Does It Revolve or Just Turn a Little? And ours is at the just turn a little stage. If we can move on to the next slide. Thank you. So our journey started, as Paul said, it was never intended as the sole source of funding. We used a strategic approach to set up the fund. So under our overarching sustainability strategy, which has goals and targets to reduce emissions and to become carbon neutral by 2022, we did a specific report about how best to get to carbon neutral in 2018. And that recognised a number of things. Number one is that we need to do more and do it quicker to get there, and particularly to follow the energy hierarchy. And prior to that time, we were spending quite an amount of money on green power. So our seed funding for what became called the Energy Management Fund was actually our previous annual spend on green power, which was quite substantive because we were offsetting 100% of our street lighting and 50% of our large buildings. So it was around about $330,000 a year. So that became the seed funding, and council signed off on setting up an energy fund, reviewing it after 4 years. So we've got a 4-year window to accelerate the works we're doing in reducing our emissions and our energy consumption. We set up a working group which oversees the general operation and the prioritisation and how and what we do within the fund. It had the manager of finance, the manager of assets and capital works, the manager of engineering and environment, and myself, and I'm the assistant manager for sustainability here at Whitehorse. So those 4 people came, and the governance arrangements were that it would be a separate line item in the accounts. There would be an annual, just a financial reconciliation of what had gone in and what had gone out of the account during that year. And it was also intended that there would be progress reports that would go to the senior management and also to council periodically about how we're going, what we're funding from it, and just generally its progress, all leading up to a review just before the 4-year period to say how it's worked, do an evaluation and see if we're going to continue it in an ongoing sense. We borrowed some operational guidelines and made them Whitehorse. So we thank Maroondah Council for their guidance on how they set up their account. We had some priorities about what must happen. What criteria must be met to spend some money from the fund. 3 essentials. It had to have energy use savings, greenhouse reductions and financial savings, and a further 2 from a drop-down list basically, which could also improve amenity, improve staff understanding of how carbon management works, minimising risk, or a community benefit. So they're the broad criteria. The business, the prioritising of what is spent out of the fund is a mixture of looking at business cases, looking at payback periods, how well it aligns to council strategies, how ready to go it is, and what's the risk if we don't do it, and particularly does it contribute towards our targets for reduction. Now the benefit of our fund is that we can fund either capital works or operational expenditure, and subject to those criteria I mentioned before. So if we wanted to develop a business case, to engage some consultants that might recommend some form of energy roadmap or energy priority projects, that's legitimate within the criteria of the fund. So now we come to the tricky part, which is the reinvestment. So we started off with the seed funding, originally intended that all savings from any projects funded through the Energy Management Fund would be directed back into the fund. The actual to date, where we're at, well, anything that is hard cash back, so where there's been a utility billing error or where we've actually got a contribution of funds one way or another, those real dollars, if you like, go back into the fund. However, some of those, particularly the utility cost savings, where they are in fact an avoided cost in the future, in other words, had we not picked up the error or had we not changed things, we would have continued to spend money. Those longer term savings, as yet, there's been no agreement to put that back into the fund. Now that was foreseen as part of the original arrangements, but the complications and the challenges in setting up how you actually measure that, how you quantify that, how you get everybody to agree on how it's quantified, and also simply internally to account for it. So in other words, to move funds from or savings from one area of council to another, that became a bit more challenging, particularly at budget time. So we've still got a long way to go at Whitehorse in terms of how to make it a bit more sustainable in terms of the amount that we can reinvest there. We are doing a fairly major energy performance contract with guaranteed savings, and those savings so far have been treated as savings rather than an opportunity to reinvest. So our finance people have really wanted us to reflect the payback period by saying that the utility costs in the affected buildings will reduce by the amount of the projected savings. So rather than us being able to capture those savings and reinvest them into this fund, they've gone back as ongoing savings. So that's some of our challenges, the different expectations people had within the fund. Obviously, some people saw it, and as Paul mentioned, there is a risk that if you have something called an energy management fund, people will see that as the panacea for everything. It is not. Again, as Paul said, the energy fund here at Whitehorse is just a mix of a range of things. Our original sustainability strategy, going back to our strategic approach, was to make each area as sustainable as possible within its own day-to-day operations and its own day-to-day works. So that meant that we would want sustainability to be built into every capital works project, into works practices that and the materials we used and so on. So we didn't want a central department telling everybody how to be sustainable, nor did we want a central fund where the expectation would be that everything would be funded from that fund. So we've had some discussions over the past year or so about rolling some of those smaller other capital works items into this fund to try and boost the seed funding aspect. We've had some discussions around whether we tighten up the criteria or keep them flexible. We've obviously had some benefits in keeping them flexible because as technology changes or as new grant funding opportunities come up, we've obviously been able to say, well, hang on, this is within the spirit of the fund. Let's invest some of the funding towards that. So in terms of the lessons learned, for those of you starting on the journey, get it aligned with your strategies, get some key people on board. It is important to have finance as a critical partner in this. It takes time and resources not only to set it all up, but then to keep it going and to keep an eye on it. And you need quite clear criteria that everybody agrees on, or else you just get into this backwards forwards discussion about that that's not legitimate or we can't use the fund for that. And in terms of whether you should build it up as being the big fund to spend energy, I would recommend, as Paul said, that you just make sure it sits neatly into, yes, it's an important fund, mainly for those smaller works, because in terms of other capital works, we would want sustainable measures to be built into any new builds or any refits as part of the capital works and not draw down on the funding. Although as just a note to others, yes, as part of our energy performance contract, $2 million over 2 years at 8 council buildings, some of that capital funding was drawn from the energy management fund. So we, as Paul said, nothing guarantees the fund being raided. I'll leave it there in the interests of time, and happy to answer any questions or follow up any questions after the webinar. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Awesome.
Paul,
Thanks,
you want to
Amy.
go straight on to Jody? I'm going to unmute you, Jody, and just pass straight on. And Paul, you've still got the control, so I'll just pass over to you.
Hello. Thanks for inviting me to speak today. I'm the Climate Change Coordinator from Mount Alexander Shire Council. I have been with the council for less than a year, so I did a bit of sleuthing to find the history of our energy and water savings reserve, which apparently started in 2005. And as we just learned, they all need seed funding. In our instance, the seed funding came from energy savings that resulted from switching to a new energy contractor. And a trust fund was set up with the intention to be a revolving fund. However, it was not used for a very long time, but I understand that it was topped up again once the new energy contracting arrangement saved money again. So that that fund sat off the books, so to speak. It wasn't part of, it wasn't sort of subject to council decision making. It's quite a unique situation. when in 2013 one of my predecessors arrived, he saw the opportunity to use it as it was intended and started to draft a management policy for using the fund, which actually didn't stand alone and currently sits within another policy which governs all sorts of discretionary reserves. Those include developer contributions, waste charges, unspent grants, and uncompleted works, and then what we call the energy and water savings transfers. So just before I move on to how those transfers are made, the process that's outlined in that policy for accessing that money applies to all of those reserves, and as a first port of call, they need to be approved by the annual budget process, and that happens in most cases. If any a subsequent drawdown happens after that process, it only needs director approval if it's less than 10% or 20k variance in the budget. Greater than that, the CEO approves it. If outside of the budget process we want to access that funding, anything below 20,000 can be approved by the CEO. Otherwise, it does have to go to council for approval. So, as opposed to the original trust fund, there's a lot of council involvement in the budgeting decisions. Next slide, Paul. Yes, and in terms of how those transfers are made, as I noted on the previous slide, most of the projects that have been funded through the fund, which was, I think it started out at about 80,000, and it sort of sits around that. We're a small council, so it's not a huge amount of money. But if any of the solar projects that have been funded through that, where we have data that tells us how much energy has been saved because of solar, that is accounted for every year, and simply an email is sent to the finance department, and they do a little report and show that I think probably last year something like $25,000 was saved from the solar arrays. The intention of the fund is that that money is topped up until 125% of the initial project cost has been transferred. So that's just really a broad brush rule of thumb to keep the fund topped up, and recognising the need to pay back some sort of interest. Each project, in order to be approved, so I'll just keep on that last slide, Paul, if you don't mind. Each one to be approved has to produce what's called an environmental upgrade agreement. It's an internal document that includes the business case and shows, you know, what the payback period is and so forth. So just the quick example there: if you've spent 7,000 on a solar energy system, we'll need to pay back 8,750 to the reserve. Now, I'll just on this slide, I'll just make a comment as to, you know, this is a very kind of simple process. There's not any sophisticated platform or communication portal or anything like that. It's based a lot on trust and the relationship between the climate change coordinator and the finance team. So in a way, I think you know, that might be good news for some smaller councils. You can simply just create through a policy and agreement, and because we have what we use is the end phase data portal, we have access to transparent data on solar. However, we don't have ways of estimating other savings that might result from energy efficiency, for example. So next slide, thanks, Paul. At the moment, we are releasing our roadmap to carbon neutrality for our own operations in the next little while. As part of this, we have recommended revisiting the revolving fund, particularly for our building upgrades, and also to try to improve on our ability to monitor energy efficiency savings from big investments like HVAC and so on, so that we can top up the fund further. We're also interested in whether or not it might be available for some of the other project opportunities that Paul mentioned earlier, because the sustainability work in our council is limited in budget, so this is an opportunity for us to expand our reach. The electricity savings from the new contract that we're entering into may well top up the fund. So that's an interesting kind of repeat of history in our case. And also looking to what happens at the end of our carbon neutrality roadmap at 2025, whether or not, if we get to the stage where all of the buildings that are under our management have kind of exhausted the opportunities for energy efficiency upgrades, whether we might sort of transform that fund into more of a community fund for at least our community managed buildings. Overall, I think it would be useful to have some kind of better monitoring and reporting, even though the simplicity of the current arrangement is good for getting started. I actually think something like a kind of Excel spreadsheet tool, something a little bit more sophisticated than what we currently have would be good, just particularly as staff turnover kind of compromises our organizational history and memory. But we're also looking at the Agility platform, particularly how they measure the savings of energy efficiency from different projects, and helping us with a portal to better report and communicate that. So that's a few ideas for the future. And thank you for listening.
Thanks, Jodie. That's great. I can see some of you already asking questions in the question box. Please keep typing them in. Because we started a little bit late this morning, what we may do is move the questions to post 12 o'clock. So keep typing them in, and we will do the Q&A. And note, we will be documenting all the Q&A as well. So if you can't stay past 12 o'clock, that's okay. We will be sending a recording of the webinar and also some information about the Q&A that occurred. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some issues that can arise with revolving funds. And we've already heard a few of them from Ian and Jodie. The first one that hits revolving funds, usually in about year 3 or 5, is that the accounting system becomes complicated. I recall when I was working at Banyule Council, we had done maybe 10 projects, and revolving the money was quite straightforward because it was moving money from a small number of accounts. Once we decided to do a project which covered 200 buildings, then we decided to change the accounting system and not, in fact, transfer money from all the different individual accounts, but to simplify the accounting process so that finance were happy that the savings were occurring, and in fact the money would then just be allocated to the revolving fund as opposed to being taken out of someone else's account. And there are other reputational issues and organisational issues with taking money from other people's accounts as well, which are best avoided if you can. Sometimes the bill actually won't decrease. And so it is actually can be quite tricky to prove savings, particularly for smaller projects and lots of smaller projects. So the process that you work up with finance around identifying what the savings are, it is useful to have a method that doesn't necessarily rely on the bills, but has logical and sensible calculations within them. This one comes up all the time when council does not pay the bills. So there are lots and lots of situations where it is community groups or sporting clubs or whatever it is who pay the bills. This is really a question for council and needs to be defined within how the fund works, whether you're including efficiency projects on community facilities. A good example is that often libraries are run by a library corporation. They could be a regional library corporation, and the bills are paid through that library corporation. So technically council doesn't pay the bills, but in reality councils will fund those library corporations. So a cost saving to a library ends up being a cost saving to council, but it is not a really clear trail back. And this becomes really a question, how do you want to manage it? And certainly if you want to manage it simply, you may well include buildings that councils don't pay the bills for, but you wouldn't be then looking at an accounting process which is trying to recoup that money. That's our recommendation anyway. What other issues? Well, how does the fund even work? What are the good projects? How do we start? What happens after 5 years once we've delivered all the key projects? So these are all good questions which we'll answer shortly. And the main one, which is often not thought about or not designed into the start of the fund, is around communication. And to be honest, out of any of these things on the screen, the communication element is probably the most important. It is the one that makes sure that that energy fund line item is not crossed out. So communication is critical. Let's talk a little bit about each of these. So in terms of the accounting process, simplicity is key. Although we have heard from Jody that it is useful to have documentation and it is useful to have transparency around the information and how the fund is built. However, the key thing that defines both the simplicity and the transparency is your relationship with the finance team. Probably not so much handshaking these days, probably more, I don't know, virtual fist bumping or something else. The key thing around any of the accounting process is to sit down with your finance team, think through what the actual mechanisms are, and agree to how it will work. And it is completely reasonable to use the first few projects as a test run and then redefine and recheck how the accounting system works. Again, we'd recommend not taking money out of other accounts, but making sure the information is clear and real is key. If you're not sure if the information is clear and the savings are clear, then discount the savings or get better information. The thing that you really don't want to be doing is arguing over the numbers. You want to make sure you're both happy with the numbers, and if that means being conservative, be conservative. In terms of communication, there's a few things that you should be doing. So obviously reviewing the numbers with finance, reporting annually, and then reviewing the strategy probably every 3 years. And what we mean by reviewing the strategy is what projects are you going to do for the next 3 years? How is the money going to be spent? What did you learn from the projects you've just completed? Is there changes to the fund and how it works that you want to implement? Every 3 years is a reasonable time frame, and it sets out your plan, for that coming period. The other thing to keep in mind around communication is it's a mix of storytelling. So you want to be talking about who benefited, what was the project, and some nice pictures and communication and data. So you want to be able to be providing a graph like this. So when I first started in doing these sorts of projects in councils, the thing that really impressed me was the Newcastle City Council revolving fund. And they showed a graph like this about the savings they'd achieved over, I think it was 8 years or 10 years at that point. And it is very powerful to be able to show how the savings grow. So if you are going to record and document information, make sure it's not just this is what we saved. It's actually here's the history and here's the savings over time, because this is what you'll go back to in 5, 10, or someone else will go back to years' time to prove that this is a good idea and that it makes sense to continue to fund. The other thing about communication is we'd recommend not overcooking it. So keep it relatively simple. Make sure you do storytelling, make sure you provide the data, and you talk with finance, but then move on to projects. All right, function of the fund. Let's talk a little bit about this. This is not a how-to list, but these are the sorts of things that you do need to include when defining the fund. And I did note a question from Jay to Ian about whether it's possible to get the operational guidelines from Whitehorse. So we'll certainly ask Ian whether that's possible, and if so, we'll share with everyone. In terms of the function of the fund, obviously it needs a name, what sorts of projects are included. Is it just energy or resource efficiency generally? What's the reporting and communication elements? And then what is the seed funding? In terms of seed funding, we generally recommend that you have a relatively large project to start with. So it could be, you know, solar on 20 buildings, it could be a large scale street lighting upgrade, anything that is a decent project, and you put up a project bid or you get external funding for that project, and you utilize that funding to create a seed. So the savings from that project then go towards these other smaller projects. Obviously, review we've already talked about. It is very helpful to talk about winding down or pausing of the fund, putting it on the shelf. And you would do this, you would not use the fund if you couldn't find or identify projects over the next 3 years to deliver. It is very normal for these sorts of revolving funds to ebb and flow. And for the first 3 to 5 years, there's actually quite a lot of projects to deliver. Then you kind of go, oh, I'm not sure what to do. And then there'll be a technology change, or there'll be a new opportunity of some sort or another. Battery storage will enable you to double the solar on your rooftops or whatever it is. And then there can be a new flurry and flush of projects. It's good to find at the start when you will pause, put the project on the fund on the shelf, and then have a project closure meeting with finance and agree when you might reopen the fund or continue it. And it could be in a year, it could be in 5 years' time. All right, setting it up. So during the startup phase, obviously you want to talk to finance, select key projects, and that could be by doing a plan, some sort of plan, or it could be actually driven by funding. So you access federal government funding for something or other, and all of a sudden you've got a windfall and you're thinking, well, why don't we generate some seed funding and do this? So it could be either planning or it could be funding based. Source the seed funding and then develop a communications plan. That's really the startup. It's quite straightforward, but the first step is talking to your finance department. And then the system, all those things we just talked about, the accounting process, the communication, and then the review process every 3 years or so. Relatively straightforward. And this applies whether you've got a revolving fund or not. It is a good way to manage your resource efficiency projects, whether there's a revolving fund or not. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about the current federal stimulus funding. As you may have heard, the federal government is contributing $500 million to local governments around the country for the local roads and community infrastructure program to help drive economic recovery. We're going to talk a little bit about what is included within it. For any of you who are familiar with the Roads to Recovery funding, this is in effect an increase or in addition to that, but it's very similar in terms of how it rolls out. There is only a little bit of information online, but the federal government are developing things rapidly around funding applications and guidelines and how it works. So all councils are automatically eligible, and the money that you get is calculated, and you will get that money if you spend it on projects in the 2020-21 year. They can't be things that are already in your budget for that year, but you can bring forward spending, you know, from the next financial year or future years. So it needs to be additional projects. There are some money and resource saving projects that are eligible. Most of the projects that are listed are things like roadworks, playgrounds, building a tunnel, for example. However, street lighting is included in the eligible activities, as is this interesting line, which is painting or improvements to community facilities. So we take that to potentially mean that could be anything you do with any of your buildings. However, I would probably wait until the guidelines come out just to see if they clarify that. Clearly at this point in time, the street lighting LED changes are included. That can obviously include your parks or streets or car parks, and there may be more opportunities to do works within community buildings as well. At this point, it's broad enough to include solar on rooftops or insulation or anything else within community buildings. I guess the key to attract funding from federal or any other stimulus is having projects ready to go. So having a list or a business case or a number of projects sitting on the shelf in your back pocket, which you can pull out and spend and deliver very quickly. With this particular stimulus funding, the key thing is it needs to be shovel ready. And obviously there are a whole bunch of other areas within council who are keen to access some of this funding. So talking in the short term with your finance department and your asset management area and providing information or answering, providing information on key opportunities you'd like to see delivered is the key thing to do, and you should probably do it in the next week if you have not already. All right, we have made it to Q&A briefly. Lex, would you like to dive in and run this part of the session?
I'd love to, thank you, Paul. And I'm going to just assume that you can see the screen there. Thanks for that, Paul. Thanks to Ian Barnes, Assistant Manager Sustainability at Whitehorse, and Jodie Newcomb, who's the Climate Change Coordinator at Mount Alex. And thank you for sticking to the updated, quick timing, and apologies for the IT glitch at the start. I should point out that this isn't the only chance to get a response and or ask questions. And so I'll actually put this next slide up that has the details, send this to everyone afterwards, but you can follow up by emailing LGES, Local Government Energy Savers Scheme, at sustainability.vic.gov.au for the next 2 weeks. So we're still available to answer any questions, but we will spend a bit of time now. We are going to ask in advance whether we can have your time if you would like to stay on for some questions. We understand if people have to leave, but don't worry, these questions will be answered and collated, but stick around if you can. My first question though, and so Paul, probably start with you, but Ian and Jodie, if you're still on the line and want to quickly jump in, does anyone know if there's been a case where a grant has provided the seed funding for a council revolving sustainability fund? I'm assuming, Paul, if not explicitly laid out as such, hi, we want money for seed funding, potentially SEEP in the past and the upcoming projects funding that you just mentioned could be it? What's your response to that?
So, well, when I was at Nellumbik Council, we actually utilised state government funding for a street lighting change, and the savings from that went into the revolving fund. So yes, absolutely. It doesn't really matter where the seed funding comes from. And generally speaking, grants are good because they often are for bigger projects as well.
Great. An interesting question that's just come on and possibly is also a little bit related to some that we had in the start and possibly the theme as well to this. And I note again at the start when we went through and looked at the people who had been involved in setting up revolving energy funds in the past, very few, like 3 or 4. And given there are a lot of experienced local government people on this line, I was a bit surprised to hear that, but possibly there's a reason. Someone has asked, due to the increase in monitoring and accounting time required, is it perhaps more efficient to calculate based on expected savings rather than actual? And if I can ask I think a slightly linked one, Paul, are there off-the-shelf products available to assist with implementation to avoid, doing other complicated Excel spreadsheets? What's your response to that?
So it is absolutely key to keep it simple. And a lot of projects you will be utilising external expertise to either do the business cases, energy audits, or whatever it is. And it makes sense to utilise the data and the information out of those audits. Obviously, if you have time, ability, and funds to do reviews of the data through monitoring, then you should do so. But again, my personal view is you should just be picking up data already available to you, discounted, like cut off 20%, move on to the next project. Don't spend too long on the auditing and the understanding of the data. Though periodically you could assess, say 1 or 3 projects out of 20 and do a deeper dive and a deeper check on the data. Obviously, you need to be utilising people who you trust and who are good, and there's heaps and heaps of really trustworthy and good practitioners in the industry who can help. In terms of off-the-shelf systems, if you are utilising a really simple process to monitor, then you don't need anything more than an Excel spreadsheet that could just simply have a line item for each project and what the agreed savings are and what the project costs were. And you're then accumulating that over a number of years.
Thanks. And I should mention, I was going to try and quickly jump in at the start and talk about, in preparation for this, as well as the questions that had come through in advance, we did actually speak to an interview about 10 or 12 councils who have been involved, and this is sort of the stuff that came through pretty loud and clear, that you don't necessarily need a proprietary product. Simplicity, simplicity, simplicity. And a lot that came back and even suggested, well, is it actually worth it? What's your end game? And I think it's more potentially all about being disciplined and building bridges between key departments within council. Do you think that's a fair comment?
Yeah, I think it'd be curious to hear from Jody, actually, because I think Jody mentioned an interest in becoming a bit more formal in some of the reporting. So maybe open it up to Jody and see what she has to comment.
Sure,
yeah.
Thanks. I was actually taking notes, Paul, as you were saying what rows to put in the spreadsheet. You're right, it can be really simple, but that has to exist. And currently, we don't have a spreadsheet that says which project was funded for how much, what were the estimated savings, what were the actual savings year on year. We have actual savings that are basically limited to what we can measure easily through, as I said, that online solar array monitoring system. But yeah, there's probably a happy medium between a complex, maybe off-the-shelf product. I don't want to say complex, but maybe expensive off-the-shelf product to just coming up with a simple spreadsheet. And I, maybe this is something for the Greenhouse Alliances or for Sustainability Victoria. With a group project, if we could hire somebody to just develop a simple spreadsheet like that just has thought about the different kinds of projects, maybe builds in different kinds of indicators, noting the White House Revolving Energy Fund takes into account other co-benefits. All of that should be able to help with reporting down the line. So being able to have one place where all that data is kept means that when you go to do your, nice little graphs and pictures for communication, it's an easy job.
Thanks, Jody. While you're on the line, question for you. Is the environmental upgrade agreement that you're using the same as the one by Sustainable Australia Fund?
No, it's an unfortunately similarly named term, which means when I go search for it on our online system, I get all of those links. But no, it's just simply for our own projects, and they are at the moment limited to building upgrades.
Thank you. We're at 12:05. Go, Paul.
Can I jump in for 1 sec, Lex? Because there was part of your question that we didn't answer, and that was around building bridges within the organisation. My personal view of revolving funds is you only do it because the most important outcome of it is to build bridges. It's actually not. The revolving part of it is to some extent a distraction. a simpler way to set up a revolving fund is to allocate, let's say 30 grand, 50, 200, whatever it is, to sustainability projects every year without doing the revolving component. But the key thing that revolving funds do is they force you to justify your spend and to integrate and work closely with your finance department on the outcomes from that fund and what it's delivering. So that is really the key outcome, is that integration with other departments and how they're working together.
Thank you, Paul. We'll go for another 8 or 9 minutes, so we'll stop at 12:15. We've got a few questions here. Keep them coming. Appreciate it. People have to leave, but we will cut it at 12:15. Someone's just made the point about the seed funding, I think, in response to that South Gippsland used savings from a Commonwealth grant 10 years ago around street lighting. So yeah, that's a good example, Luke. The grant itself had nothing about revolving energy funds mentioned in it. The grant itself was to undertake an energy efficiency project, and then council might have then used savings to set up a fund, or I'm not sure whether, again, it's probably more informal than that, just making the case for using some of that, the savings for more energy efficient projects. A couple more questions, and please do feel free to keep them coming if you like. One of the main issues I've seen with revolving energy funds has been the platform used. The platform Grits was probably the best I've seen, but would love to know if there are any others available. Now that's from Mark, who knows more about this than most people in the world. Mark, I might correct if I'm wrong, but I think Grits, which was something that the Cities Power Partnership was using for a bit, wasn't a revolving energy fund platform per se, but it allowed you to track energy. You can jump in or correct if that's not the case, but Paul, this probably goes back to the other questions, the platforms, any other platforms to use, or is it really more about simplicity, Excel spreadsheets?
I think I've already answered it, Lex. Simplicity is key,
cool.
but you need to get agreement from finance. So if they want something more complex, then build something more complex. I think you need to understand it, and finance need to understand it. And it's rubbish in, rubbish out. So as long as you are comfortable with the savings and the data going into that, then the spreadsheet or system or whatever it is doesn't really matter. It's really it's the data going into it that matters.
Great. Paul, and then Jody and Ian, if you want to jump in, please do. Any examples you know of large umbrella community organisations using revolving funds, Girl Guides, Scouts, local football leagues, etc.?
Well, the one that springs to mind, which is probably a little bit of a sideways step from your question, there are actually quite a large number of community energy groups who are raising funds to install solar on community buildings, or solar farms, or wind turbines, or anything else. And the savings and income from those projects are typically being used to reinvest and redeliver more systems. So they are a classic revolving fund.
Jody and Ian, if you would like to jump in, please feel free to unmute yourself. Have a think about that one. Otherwise, I might just move on to a couple more questions we've got here. What do you think about the fund being used to invest in conventional investment strategies if they include a focus on sustainability, or is the storytelling aspect of more tangible projects better as a sole focus?
I apologise for jumping in. Please jump in, Jody or Ian, if you have any other comments. I think it's really powerful to be upgrading a HVAC system, spending another 20% on it, but saving 40% of the energy. It's really powerful to integrate the fund into BAU decisions and to enable council to make better decisions and invest in better systems that last longer, lower maintenance, better energy. That's a powerful story. That's a really good storytelling element, particularly for targeting your internal staff. So it's angles, and storytelling is all about the people who are affected and the outcome. So I'm very happy and comfortable with these sorts of funds actually enhancing and improving spending decisions of councils. Ultimately, you want most of that to be BAU, but in reality, with budget squeezes and other things, you've got to be practical about how it's applied.
Ian?
Yeah, look, I've just got an example from which speaks to the partnership between finance and sustainability. Our $2 million energy performance contract came up at, well, it was a slow build, but we got it approved and it wasn't yet listed on the long-term capital works program. So one of the things that helped get it over the line and get it funded and in fact reduced the ask for additional capital works funding was that some of the project is funded from a drawdown of the Energy Management Fund. So that was an example of how it helped to justify the project and get it onto the formal program ahead of some others that might have wanted 100% additional funding. This was a bit of the storytelling, and back to Paul's point about communication, I think, yes, having the Energy Management Fund there as part of the storytelling so that you can continue to reinforce the value of investing in energy savings is a good part of having the fund.
Perhaps we can finish up with this one then, related to that, I think. More detail on how do you gain the support from the finance department? So how do you start the conversation in a more conservative or small council? So Paul, you've just started a job, you're leaving Ironbark, putting everyone else in charge, and you've gone to I won't name council names, you've gone to a small council. How are you going to start that conversation with someone that just wants a tea to get lost?
Listen, so the way I always start conversations with councils is talking about what other councils do. And so that's how I would pitch this. And obviously you need to identify who the right person to speak to is. You need to be quite straight and honest and say this is what they do, this is how it works, and this is why we're interested in it. And then get their thoughts on it. I would expect most finance departments to say, that's interesting, can you get more information, or here are all our questions and queries and issues, or here is the right timing for us to talk about this properly. And probably right now is not necessarily awesome because they're madly running around working out budgets and other things with COVID-19. But so picking your timing and making sure you're giving the finance department control over the discussion and when it happens and how it happens is how I would go about it. But definitely just talking about here's a bunch of other councils that are already doing it. We think it's a good idea because of these reasons.
Paul, can I jump in there and just say, bring up a point you made earlier, just in relation to timing with these federal government funds. It might actually be the right time, because I had a conversation yesterday with our executive infrastructure. How are we going to spend the $1 million that we've been given by the federal government? And I'd love to put it towards the lighting upgrades. And the first thing I said was, because we will earn $38,000 a year from year one. And what better way to use this money than to use it to make more money? So it could be a good time just to give that seed funding and that pitch that kind of makes it feel like, the goodwill will keep on flowing.
Yep.
I'd just like to quickly add to Paul's comments about how you get your finance people on board. Our approach was to make sure that it was embedded as part of the strategic approach of council. So the sustainability strategy is also aligned to council's broader 4-year plan and long-term vision. So the specific following the energy hierarchy is embedded within the broader sustainability strategy. So being able to point to the fact that something that council has already endorsed, and then following that up by saying it is not all about the environmental benefits, there is also a financial payback period or a financial benefit to this, helps that relationship with finance.
Thank you for that, Ian. And I would just add that my response to that question is it's not so much then around how do you gain support from the finance department for revolving energy funds and how do you talk about those things, but it's more talking about energy and finance savings, and it's how you would start that conversation in any way, shape or form. I agree with Paul's point too around here is what other councils are doing, and we do actually have those conversations with councils all the time. It's the concept of social proof, and I would encourage anyone who's struggling to influence difficult finance teams or senior sustainability managers or whoever senior finance managers to look at things like Richard Cialdini's weapons of influence. And so using those principles of social proof and authority and reciprocity can help build the relationships, and then you can influence and get them to have a higher chance of reciprocating and helping do what you want. I'm going to move on and close it up now. Thanks again. Thanks for those that stayed. It looks like the majority of people did actually stick around.